Hi, Carol. Hi, Lisa. We're
Hi,
gonna,
Desiree.
we're gonna listen.
Days.
I'm gonna ask everybody to mute yourselves, and I'm going to play something. We're gonna listen to music. Welcome. Thank you for being here. As always, I hope everyone is well, physically and mentally. These times are trying. I realize tonight I have two big assignments. I have to make this interesting for both those of you who know the opera well and those of you who don't. And I have to get it done before the debate starts. So, also, as always, I would love comments and questions. Please save them for the end. Let me say, first of all, that Richard Strauss was my mother's favorite composer. She loved Strauss operas, the tone poems, and the Lieder. The piece we were just listening to at the beginning is Morgen, sung by Elisabeth Schwarzkopf with the London Symphony Orchestra led by George Szell. Strauss composed it in 1894 as a part of a group of four Lieder as a wedding gift to his wife Pauline. The thing about Strauss is that he is a composer of unrivaled descriptive power and remarkable ability to convey psychological detail in his music. Strauss himself had two musical gods, Mozart and Wagner. And in his work, they struggle for the possession of his artistic soul. Okay, so here we go. Richard Strauss and Rosenkavalier. He's born in 1864 and he dies in 1949. I find it fascinating to contemplate the idea of someone's life straddling 2 centuries, that the changes they lived through, like especially that time from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. Anyway, he's born in Munich. His father is the principal horn of the court opera in Munich and a professor at the Königliche Musikschule. He has a younger sister, Berta Johanna, who lives until 1966, when she is 98, and about whom not much is written. The only thing I could find is that her husband was a military man in World War I, and that he died in 1942, so I don't really know anything else. A word about his grandfather. So Franz is his father, and he's a horn player. His father was of unsteady character. His children were illegitimate, and he left their upbringing to their mother, who was a member of a large musical family. Her brother, so Richard's great uncle, took over the lessons of the young Franz Strauss. And Franz Strauss becomes Richard Strauss's first music teacher. Richard starts piano at 4, and he writes his first composition at 6. It's a song, and his mother writes the words to it because little Richard doesn't know how to make letters yet. He can write music, but he doesn't know how to write letters. He continues composing until his death. At age 8, he begins violin lessons, and at 11, he has music theory and orchestration lessons from a colleague of his father's, who is the assistant conductor at the Court Opera in Munich. I can find no reference to any indication that Richard Strauss had formal composition lessons. I'd love to know if anyone else knows this, and if you can either tell me at the end or email me. I'd love to know this, because the fact that he was only taught orchestration and that he absorbed structure and harmony during his work as a conductor, to me is incredible, that he sort of is self-taught in a way. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. His parents make music making a part of home life. There were frequent musical guests. His father exposes him to the great composers, Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart, Schubert, Schumann, and his father also acts as an editor for his son's compositions. He makes suggestions, he makes advice, he gives comments. He shows his son's compositions to his colleagues, and he manages to showcase the works in an amateur orchestra of which he is the conductor. Clearly, his father has a huge influence on his taste, particularly for the French horn, which remains a big part of his orchestrations until the end of his life. His father also forbade the young Richard Strauss to study the works of Richard Wagner, as he found them too progressive, and he views his works with great suspicion. Even though he himself, this is Franz the father, had played the principal horn in the orchestra for the premieres of Tristan, Meistersinger, Siegfried, and others. In any case, little Richard hears his first Wagner operas at age 10. Lohengrin and Tannhäuser, and at 12 or 13 he hears The Ring, Meistersinger, Tristan, and Isolde. But during this time his father keeps the scores from him. However, at 16, Richard gets his hands on the score to Tristan, and since he is still under the influence of his father, he has a relatively negative impression of Wagner and all his music. Richard is 16 in 1880. And Wagner dies 3 years later in 1883. Later in his life, Strauss says he deeply regretted the conservative and hostile prejudice he carried to Wagner's works early in his life. Just before Strauss turns 18, his violin concerto is premiered in Vienna with Strauss himself at the piano, and his teacher, Benno Walter, who is sort of his father's cousin, his uncle, sort of, playing the violin. The next year, Strauss leaves for Berlin to go to university, where he stays for like 10 minutes. He stays less than a year. While he's in Berlin, he meets the conductor Hans von Bülow, I don't know how to say these things, who offers him a job with the Meiningen Court Orchestra as assistant conductor. Meiningen is geographically halfway between Berlin and Munich. Von Bülow had been impressed by the young composer's Wind Serenade 3 years earlier. Take stock at this for a moment. By this point, Strauss is 18. He's composed about 140 works, 59 lieder, 40 piano works, and various chamber and orchestral works. His duties in Meiningen include conducting rehearsals, managing the choir, giving music lessons to Princess Marie von Sachsen-Meiningen, and performing as piano soloist. 2 points in trivia about von Bülow. He built that orchestra into one of the finest in Germany, and it still exists today. Among other things that made him make the orchestra so great, he insisted that the musicians, and Mark, listen to this, he insisted that the musicians learn to play all of their parts by memory. Wow. Also, von Bülow had been a student of Franz Liszt's, and he married his daughter, Cosima Liszt, who later leaves him to become Cosima Wagner. Anyway, von Bülow is very, very fond of the young Strauss, and the feeling is mutual. Strauss later says that von Bülow was his best conducting teacher, crediting him with teaching him the art of interpretation. During this time, Strauss made his first major appearance as piano soloist in Mozart's Piano Concerto, number 24, with cadenzas written by Strauss himself. Apparently, what also became clear at this time is that Strauss was a whiz at the card game Skat. So this is a sidebar. I looked this up because it comes up more frequently. The more things I read about Strauss, the more times I see that he was like addicted to this game. It's a German card game. To this day, it's the national card game of Germany. And I'm not a card player, so I'm going to read this to you because I don't know how it works. It's a three-handed trick-taking game with a 32-card deck. It's usually played with 4 players. One of them sits out, so the dealer is rotating, and the dealer usually sits out. There's an opening bid, and there are trumps, and the top trump is called a matador because it kills everything else. Also, whoever wins the opening bid plays one person against 2 people. Anyway, if you look it up, make sure you get the German version because there are American versions which are very different. And I wanted to know about this game because Strauss spent a lot of time playing it. And I think it's a complicated game and it kept his brain busy. The quote that he says, though, he indicates that in his day, all day long, all his life, he hears music in his head. And when he was playing that card game, he heard quiet. So he loved to play it because it gave him a moment of stillness. Anyway, in December of 1885, von Bülow unexpectedly resigns, leaving Strauss to lead the orchestra until the end of the season in 1886, 7 months later. It's a great period for him because the orchestra is premiering Brahms' Symphony No. 4, which Brahms himself is conducting. Strauss prepares the orchestra for this. Strauss also conducts his own Symphony No. 2 in that time while Brahms is there. And Brahms would go on to comment to him, and this is a quote, "Your symphony contains too much playing about with themes. This piling up of many themes based on a triad, which differs from one to another only in rhythm, has no value." Strauss takes this well. And his music leaves such a great impression on him and this time with Brahms that he would later refer to this time in his life as Brahms Schwärmerei, Brahms adoration. I'm going to show you a picture of young Brahms. So this is very young. Can you guys see him? Nod your head or something. Yeah? Okay. It's a very young Strauss. He's 20-something here, 26. Anyway, in 1885, at this same time, he meets a guy named Alexander Ritter, who is a violinist, a composer, and a poet. He's also the husband of one of Wagner's nieces. Ritter has a huge influence on Strauss, opening his eyes to a more modern composition style, encouraging him to look at the works of Wagner and Franz Liszt, Franz Liszt was really the master of the tone poem. I'll talk about that later. Ritter also encourages Strauss to explore the writings of Arthur Schopenhauer, of Richard Wagner's writings, and a guy named Friedrich von Hausegger, which you can look up. I'm going to show you a picture of Ritter. Here we go. So this is Ritter. Sort of a teacherly looking guy. These ideas, the philosophical and the ideas of tone poems, lead Strauss towards the idea of a tone poem in his own music. In 1886, after he leaves his job in the Meiningen Orchestra, he travels through the Italian countryside on his way to his next post, the Bavarian State Opera. He had some time off and he just went traveling. He keeps notes of what he sees while he's traveling. He writes detailed descriptions of the countryside, as well as he makes tonal notes. He makes little impressions which went along with those descriptions. These notes would become the basis for his first tone poem, Aus Italien, when he is 22 in 1886. Coincidentally, and having nothing to do with anything, it was also the same year as Franz Liszt's death. In addition to clear tone painting effects, he also gives the movements programmatic names like Neapolitan Folklife. Ritter continues to be an influence on Strauss in Munich, and they meet regularly to discuss poetry, music, literature, and philosophy. So I'm going to take a little side trip and just talk about the concept of tone poem for a moment. I'm going to read because this is just said so nicely. A tone poem is a piece of music, typically in one movement, on a descriptive or rhapsodic theme, sometimes rather complex. An entire poem, a short story, a painting, a landscape, or some other non-musical source. In my book, Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, the Symphony number 6, is an early example. Beethoven having spent a lot of time in nature, and the titles of the movements express this idea. For instance, the first movement is entitled, quote, Awakening of Cheerful Feelings on Arrival in the Countryside. Franz Liszt is really the father of this codified idea, giving the actual name to the form and writing 13 symphonic works on mythical characters, historical scenes, and the human condition. The last of these symphonies entitled From Cradle to Grave. There continues to be discussion about whether the written program which accompanies concerts should explain the nature of the tone poem, or whether the audience should be left to figure it out by themselves. So what do you guys think? And we'll talk about it later, because I can see it going both ways. Strauss's tenure at the Bavarian Opera is not a happy one. The theater had financial problems, and Strauss was prevented from staging works which interested him, and the assignments he was given really bored him. He was able to find work outside Munich, in Berlin, Dresden, and Leipzig. In Leipzig, he made friends with Gustav Mahler, and he also meets a soprano in Leipzig called Pauline de Anna, who was his voice student. He then moves to Weimar in 1889 with Pauline, who is now his girlfriend. He conducts at Bayreuth, and he debuts with the Berlin Philharmonic in 1890. I've got a great picture of him from that year. There. Clearly a stage picture, but still nice. In this time, he gets pneumonia, he recovers, he goes to Greece and Egypt, and in Egypt, he gets the idea for his first opera, Guntram. Pauline sings the soprano role in that first opera, which has only modest success, to put it nicely. In 1894, when he is 30, he debuts as conductor at Bayreuth with Tannhäuser, and Pauline is singing Elisabeth. Pauline and Richard marry in 1894. She is 1 year older than he is, and by all accounts, she's a very difficult woman. Here are some of the adjectives I found about her: irascible, garrulous, eccentric, outspoken, tempestuous, cantankerous, and tactless. Exactly the opposite of Strauss. Strauss is detached and aloof. Nevertheless, by all accounts, it's a very long and happy marriage, and she remains an inspiration to him their entire life. She's also the reason that Strauss prefers the soprano voice to all others. And here is a picture of Pauline, and there they are. Oh, did I share it? There it is. Although the opera Guntram, in fact, is his first major failure, his marriage to Anna is a lifelong success. In spite of that failure, his time in Weimar brings him several important successes. He writes the tone poem Don Juan, which gives him almost immediate international fame. Also during this time, he writes Death and Transfiguration, and these works secure his position as a modernist, in addition to the success that he was already having as a conductor. He goes back to the Bavarian State Opera after this and is appointed Kapellmeister, which is a very fruitful period for him. He writes Till Eulenspiegel, also sprach Zarathustra, Don Quixote, and Ein Heldenleben. And he also serves as the principal conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic from 1894 to 95. In 1897, their only child is born, a boy named Franz. In 1898, he leaves the Bavarian Staatsoper and moves full-time to Berlin, where he remains for the next 15 years. He's now a famous conductor and composer, and there's international demand for him. He goes on tour to the United States in 1904, conducting, among other things, the world premiere of his Symphonia Domestica at Carnegie Hall, as well as a whole program of Lieder with Strauss at the piano with his wife singing. And during this time, while he's traveling, he's working on the opera Salome, which is based on the novel by Oscar Wilde. Salome premieres in Dresden in 1905 and immediately becomes an international hit. In 1906, Strauss buys property in Garmisch with the royalties that he earns from Salome. Garmisch is a ski town in southern Germany near the highest mountain in Germany. He has the Villa Strauss built, where he and Pauline will live for the rest of their lives. And he's still spending much of his free time playing the card game Skat. After Salome, he has a string of hits with his librettist Hugo von Hofmannsthal. Elektra in 1909, Rosenkavalier in 1911, Ariadne auf Naxos in 1912, Die Frau ohne Schatten in 1919, and the Egyptian Helen in 1928, and Arabella in 1933. There's not enough time tonight to talk thoroughly about von Hofmannsthal, but it is generally accepted that the libretto for Rosenkavalier is one of the best librettos of any opera ever. The partnership between Strauss and von Hofmannsthal was unique in that they really worked together. They talked about the syllables of the words and how they went with the music. And it was a partnership really that was great collaboration. Strauss continues to work as a conductor, and in addition, he co-founds the Salzburg Festival in 1920. However, after having composed a series of daring and dissonant early works, Salome and Elektra, his musical style does not continue in that modern vein, and he moves away from the Wagnerian metaphysics, and he ignores the prevailing musical winds of the time, and consistently composes in a backward-looking retrospective idiom. In hindsight, perhaps the real genius of Strauss lies in Rosenkavalier. His melodic gift, his sensitivity to language, his grasp of character and affection for an elegant past, all without the need to prove himself modern. He continues to conduct in Berlin until 1919, when he becomes the joint director of the Vienna State Opera. This proves an unfortunate post because the post-war mood is really for the new and innovative, and Strauss at 55 is now considered old-fashioned. He's neither skilled nor interested in politics, neither national or musical, and in the end, he resigns his post in 1924. Also, in 1924, Strauss's son Franz marries Alice von Grab-Hermannsworth, the daughter of a Jewish industrialist. They're married in a Roman Catholic ceremony, and they quickly have 2 sons. Anyway, just to say that Strauss's 19th century romanticisms are pleasing today, but in their own time, the concert-going public wanted new, and so he was sort of a fish out of water. This same ability of his to ignore that criticism levied at him, that he was an irrelevant survivor of a vanished age, a romantic composer in an unparalleled time of scientific and social change. At the same time, when figures such as Stravinsky, Schoenberg, Messiaen were at the forefront of new music, his unwillingness to pay attention to politics leads to a rather unfortunate situation later. But let's just take a moment and look at the musical time in which he lived. Strauss is born when Rossini and Berlioz are alive. So if you look at it, he overlaps with Liszt, with Wagner, with Brahms. Brahms is alive for a lot of Strauss's time. Engelbert Humperdinck, the composer of Hansel and Gretel and other nice things, and Gustav Mahler. So he really is in the same category of those guys. But he also lives at the same time as Stravinsky and Schoenberg and Messiaen. When he dies, it's only a few months after the premiere of Elliott Carter's Cello Concerto and John Cage's sonatas and interludes for prepared pianos, which really are in the current idea of modern. And yet at that time he composed the four last songs, which really are retrospective. In any case, throughout his life, Strauss is a champion of musicians. He's concerned for the economic condition of the musicians in Germany. He lobbies for revised copyright policy, better insurance and job protection, and increased government funding for professional musicians. After all, his royalties from Salome paid for his house, so he wants to make that sort of thing happen for everybody. His judgment of politics is skewed because it is based on the support of culture. He's myopic and can't see the larger picture of the politics. So in 1933, he is appointed by Joseph Goebbels to be president of the Reichsmusikkammer, the State Music Institute, whose function it was to promote good German music. Although Strauss never joins the Nazi Party, he is initially drawn to cooperating with the Nazi Party, hoping that Hitler, who he knows is a fan of Wagner and of his own music, will continue to promote German art and culture. He accepts the post, intending to remain apolitical, a decision which eventually becomes untenable. In his private journal, he writes very negatively of the Third Reich, that they are a disgrace. Also, in this time, he's trying to protect his daughter-in-law, Alice, and his 2 grandsons. Strauss also replaces Arturo Toscanini at Bayreuth after Toscanini resigns in protest to the Nazi regime. During this time, Strauss collaborates with the playwright Stefan Zweig, who happens to be Jewish, on the opera Die Schweigsame Frau. At the opening performance, Strauss insists that Zweig's name be on the theatrical billing. Hitler and Goebbels avoid attending the opera, and it is halted after 3 performances when a letter from Strauss to Zweig, critical of Nazi racial profiling, is intercepted by the Gestapo, and the opera is subsequently banned by the Third Reich, and Strauss is dismissed from his post. It seems that only Strauss's standing in German culture and music history has lent him a measure of clout that allows him, that allows him to survive this and protect his daughter-in-law and 2 grandsons. He is unable to protect the rest of her family, however. More than 25 of her relatives were murdered in the camps. Strauss smuggles her mother out, but he is unable to help the others. He goes to the Theresienstadt, the camp, in person and pleads on their behalf to no avail. In 1945, Strauss composes his Metamorphosen for 23 strings. It's really a piece that gives voice to his grief over the destruction of German culture, including the bombing of many opera houses in Germany. This is from Strauss's private diary at the end of the war. Quote, "The most terrible period of human history is at an end. The 12-year reign of bestiality, ignorance, and anti-culture under the greatest criminals, during which Germany's 2,000 years of cultural evolution met its doom." Strauss is apprehended by American soldiers at his villa, and he walks out and he announces to them, "I am Richard Strauss, composer of Rosenkavalier and Salome." And the lieutenant in charge happens to be a musician and knows him and puts an off-limits sign on his lawn. I have a picture of his house. So there's mountains, and it's a beautiful, beautiful house. And he lives there. If you ever get the chance to go, look at his house. It is still exactly the way it was when he lived there. You can see where he composed. You can see where he played cards. The bed where he died, nothing has changed. Like most Germans, at the end of the war, his bank accounts and assets were seized. And he needed to make some money. So he went on a 3-week tour of London, conducting several of his tone poems, excerpts from his operas. And the trip was a critical success, providing him much needed cash. During the post-war years, Strauss had a great upsurge in productivity. He wrote Horn Concerto No. 2, Metamorphosen, which I said, the Oboe Concerto, a duet concertino for clarinet and bassoon, and his 4 last songs, which he composes from May to September 1948, which deal with death and dying. They are such heart-rending songs. I won't play them, but please, if you don't know them, go to wherever you listen to music and just sit in a dark room and listen. The wonder of Strauss is that even not understanding the words, the text is painted in the music. In June of 1948, Strauss is cleared of any wrongdoing by the Denazification Tribunal in Munich. He dies in September 1949 after a summer of 85th birthday celebrations, and his funeral is conducted by a young Georg Schulte, who was 36 at the time. Strauss himself directed that the final trio from Rosenkavalier should be played and sung at his funeral, and all the singers, in turn, broke down during the ceremony. Pauline dies 8 months later, and I have a beautiful picture of the two of them as an older couple. Just so nice the way she's looking at him. Okay, Rosenkavalier. Rosenkavalier premiered on the 26th of January 1911 at the Königliches Opernhaus in Dresden. By the time he writes Rosenkavalier, Salome and Elektra were terrific hits, and Strauss wanted to present the audience with something less strident. He was a huge fan of Mozart, and he wanted to write something in the ilk of Figaro. Many of the ideas for Rosenkavalier come from von Hofmannsthal's correspondence with a friend of his, Graf Kessler, a guy named Harry, who had seen a short-lived comedy in Paris called L'Ingénu Libertin. Before I go on, I'd like to discuss 2 more terms. First is the pants roll. The first evidence of women in the theater comes from London in the 1660s after the plague. Theaters needed gimmicks to get people back in theaters. And women in the cast were perfect vehicles. The audience was so happy to see women on stage, to see their shapes. And the added excitement of seeing a woman dressed in men's clothing playing the part of boys was just a bonus. In the 1700s, early opera had the convention of using a castrati to sing the roles of young men. And sometimes not just minor roles, major roles, because a castrato actually had an incredibly powerful voice. Think of Handel's Julius Cesare, or Rodelinda, or Gluck's Orfeo, and even Mozart's Idamante from the opera Idomeneo. But castrati roles are not the same as pants roles. The idea of a pants roll in opera starts near the early 1800s. The best example is Cherubino. A mezzo-soprano is used to play the part of a young man, or a boy even, maybe. Again, it is stimulating for the audience to see a woman in men's clothing, because it just wasn't done. And there's added titillation for her to be in a romantic situation with another woman. We understand that to carry the plot forward, we have to believe that the character is a boy, but still somehow we know it's a woman, and it's exciting. Other examples besides Cherubino and Octavian are Nikolaus in The Tales of Hoffmann, Cybele in Faust, Hansel in Hansel and Gretel, and the composer in Ariadne auf Naxos. And the other term that I want to touch on really quickly is leitmotifs. Wagner is the father of the notion of a leitmotif, or what is thought as a leading motive. It is a short theme or motive which is attached to a character, an emotion, an idea, or even an important object. Think the sword. It can just be 3 or 4 notes, or just a musical germ or idea, or even just a chord which is presented in a meaningful way. But the leitmotif has to be strong and obvious so that it is always recognizable and memorable. And with that, we're going to start with the cast. So, the characters in the opera. We have the Marschallin, who is also known as Princess Marie-Thérèse von Werdenberg. And interestingly enough, in early Met programs, she's always referred to as the Princess von Werdenberg. We have Octavian, who is Count Refrano, who is her 17-year-old lover. And let me just say, the Marschallin is 32. So she's not old. We have Baron Ochs auf Lerchenau, who is her country cousin, and he is boorish, but he's an aristocrat. And let me just say that he is supposed to be 35. In a lot of Rosenkavalier productions, we see him looking like Falstaff. And in his manner, I think Strauss intended him to be like Falstaff in that he's blustery and has no self-awareness, but he's not supposed to be ugly. And then we have Sophie from Foninal, who is his soon-to-be bride, bought. She is fresh out of the convent. She's 15, and her father is nouveau riche, and her father has money but no status, and so by marrying her off to Baron Ochs, the Baron gets the money, and Sophie and her family get the aristocratic position. And those are the major characters. Those are really who the opera's about. And we have her father, we have her chaperone, we have 2 Valsacchi and Annina, who are what they call intriguers. I see them as paparazzi. They're just sort of nosy and trying to make trouble. And then there's an Italian singer, and really the Italian singer is there so that Strauss could actually write some beautiful music that was even more old-fashioned than what he was already writing. There's a notary, there's 3 noble orphans, and there's a vendor of pets. Okay, so let's look at their leitmotifs. I'm only going to play a very little bit of viola today because it's not easy to portray what Strauss does in one single line. The beauty of Strauss is in his harmony and the orchestration. So make sure you watch the opera and listen. So we are introduced to much of the leitmotifs in the opera in the overture. And even though the Marschallin is the first character, the overture begins with Octavian's music. I'm going to speak a little graphically, so there's going to be it's a warning here. Octavian's music is an upward thrusting motive played by the brass section. And we'll hear this dotted figure many times through the opera in different guises. And it goes like this. And it's played by the whole horn section and lots of brass. And it comes back later. He's dressed up as a servant girl, and it's in 3. So we hear pa 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 pa, and it goes on like that. It's in the violins, but that comes later. So what comes next is the character of the Marschallin. She's 32. She's his lover. Her theme answers his. It's a downward falling motive played on the softer and gentler violins. So she plays. So I'm going to play him and her. So. And that's how the opera starts. Strauss clearly is not sure who exactly is this opera is about. It seems to be about the Marschallin, but the title is the Rosenkavalier. In fact, the original title of the opera was Ochs von Lerchenau. However, I'm not sure it matters. It's whatever. Then there is the rapture that they experience in the post-coital moment. And this is just like the afterglow. Oh, wait. So this is that moment where they're, where I guess in the 1940s they'd be smoking. And it's pillow talk and the second more developed theme, and this is really a love theme, I think, and we hear it more. And to me, this has a nod to Verdi because the huge leaps in the melody. And so I'm going to play the overture for you now. And we're going to listen to the overture. And we're going to listen to about 3 minutes of it. Because you're going to hear da-da-dum, bum, 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 da-da-da. You hear them, and you also hear the actual sex thing. You hear his, and you hear hers, and we're just going to listen to it. You're going to hear birds. It's going to be birds for the morning. Okay, and that's how the opera starts. The curtain comes up there, and we see them in bed. And this is a very difficult thing for the director to do because it's two women in bed, and in 1912, a year afterward, the opera is sort of censored in this way, and von Hofmann, and I think Strauss is told you have to either get rid of the bed or get rid of any mention of the bed. And so productions after that, for years after that, are done with Octavian fully dressed and she's in bed, or Octavian's outside. And anyway, so the next character is Baron Ochs, and his music is pompous and clunky, and it goes like this. And that's we hear him. There's other music that we hear from him also, but and you'll notice this as it goes on, that there is music that you hear over, and it's also some of it is subliminal. The essence of the story is about the passage of time, that life goes on. I'm not going to give the synopsis precisely since it's pretty easy to follow, but basically, the Marschallin is in a loveless marriage with a man she was forced to marry when she was 15. We clearly get the impression that she's had lovers before and will have lovers after Octavian, but somehow this moment in time is very difficult for her. She tells him that he will leave her for someone younger, and that at night, when everyone is sleeping, she walks through the palace and stops the clocks in order to halt the passage of time. She's very introspective during the course of the opera, musing on the fact that life goes on. We see her strength and her wisdom, which is the backbone of her character. Strauss has her tell, or von Hofmannsthal has her tell Octavian, that what we embrace too tightly slips away. She says something like, "He who embraces too much holds on to nothing." She is, of course, referring not only to time, but her feelings for the young man. The secondary plot is that of Sophie's unhappiness at being sold off to the Baron. She doesn't immediately see it that way, but that's the essence of it. Octavian is engaged as the Baron's emissary to present the rose, which is a token of his intention toward her. But he, Octavian, and Sophie fall in love at that moment, and they hatch a madcap comedic plot to discredit the Baron and relieve Sophie of her obligation to him. Along the way of this story, there is love, there's sex, there's sarcasm and comedy. There's a contrast between young and old, well, let's say older, because she's not really old, she's 32. The experienced and the innocent, the sincere and the obnoxious. Pair all of this with a costume extravaganza and a setting which takes place inside a fairy tale palace, and voila, Rosenkavalier. A note on time. There's a lot of action on stage in the opera. There are many characters singing, often at the same time. But there are three incredibly beautiful moments where time stops. The first is at the end of the first act, as the Marschallin has a monologue when she muses on time. And then the second is in Act 2 at the presentation of the rose. In the moment that we see Octavian with the rose and Sophie sees him, to me it's like that feeling at the top of a Ferris wheel where you just stop for a moment. There's a moment of like, and the last beautiful moment is in Act 3, when there's the trio between the Marschallin, Octavian, and Sophie, which is the trio that Strauss himself wanted at his funeral. Unlike in Figaro, though, Strauss makes no comment on the questionable morality of the characters. Not only the affair between the Marschallin and Octavian, but about Faninal selling his daughter for status, or Baron Ochs's lecherous behavior. Strauss really turns a blind eye to it all. And the audience doesn't mind. I mean, it seems sort of the way it was. Rosenkavalier is Strauss's attempt to write, as he put it, a Mozart opera. After Elektra, he says, and this is a quote, I'm going to try and Das nächste Mal schreibe ich eine Mozart-Oper. Next time, I'm going to write a Mozart opera. And in fact, both operas open with a bed scene. The opening of Rosenkavalier starts with the Marschallin and Octavian in bed, and this is an homage to the opera Figaro, which opens with the title character measuring where his marriage bed will go. I feel that Strauss also put some elements of Verdi in. The thematic material with the large leaps, so da 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 da. In the end of Aida, Radames and Aida sing da 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 da. Very big leaps. Also, clearly, the fugue at the end, at the beginning of Act 3 in Rosenkavalier is a nod to the fugues that Verdi writes in his operas. It's killer writing that fugue at the beginning of the third act, and it only can be played well by a really good orchestra. So listen carefully to us, because we're good. Another fun fact is that performance practice often has the orchestra speak during the opera. Carlos Kleiber, the great conductor who conducted us in this opera in 1990, had us sing in the third act when Baron Ochs is in the tavern, and he asks, what are all you doing down there? And we sing in the vocal parts that says, and I'm going to show you because he left us notes on our stand. So we came into work and found this bottom part here. This is Kleiber's handwriting. So what machst du da, or something like that, and we say serviert euer Gnaden, and we all had to sing that as loud as we could, which was a lot of fun. Simon Rattle had us introduce, here you can see this here, he had us introduce Baron Ochs in Act 2, and Baron Ochs walks in, and we all go, whoosh, whoosh, I can't whistle anymore. And the music here, you can say, da da dum, bum, bum, da 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 dum, whoosh, Herr Schmidt. And if you listen, you'll hear, if you remember what I just said, you'll hear that. Strauss peppers this opera with the Viennese waltz, made popular by his unrelated namesake Johann Strauss. He makes one continuity mistake, and this is like a movie thing, but Rosenkavalier is set in the 1740s, but the Viennese waltz does not become popular in Europe until the mid-1880s. In any case, in this instance, it's a moot point because the Met sets this opera in the early 1900s, at the time of the First World War, but more saliently, at the very time that Strauss wrote it. The premiere performance at the Met was December 9, 1913, and on January 4th, 2020, with Simon Rattle, Sir Rattle, we gave the 400th performance of the opera at the Met. One final comment, or hopefully final. This production is fantastic. Renée Fleming had sung the role 20 years earlier and came back to it with a mature interpretation which completely suits the role. Alina Garancha is such an amazing actor with an amazing voice, beautiful voice. After you see her as Octavian, you should check her out as Carmen. She is an incredibly believable boy and an amazingly sexy woman. And the bass is Günter Grosbuch. He is amazing. He's like an actor. He does physical comedy. He sings beautifully. His Viennese dialect is hysterical. The production is from the Royal Opera House in London, and Robert Carson, the director, was also the director of Falstaff. Again, make sure to stay tuned after the opera is over and watch the added features. The tenor Matthew Polenzani, who sings the role of the Italian tenor in this production, also interviews all of the main characters, and just being backstage gives you a great view of what it's like during scene changes. One last bit of trivia. In 1925, von Hofmannsthal wrote a screenplay for a film version of Rosenkavalier, which you can actually find on YouTube. By that time, there was censorship about two women in bed together. And so in his movie version, the Marschallin is in bed and Octavian is fully dressed, calling up to her window from below. Okay, that's all I got. Thank you for listening. First of all, does anybody know if Strauss had a composition teacher? And the other thing was, what do you think about having program notes for people who, for pieces that are programmed? So unmute yourselves because I can't hear you. Hi.
Okay. So about program notes, I always like program notes.
Louise, I can't understand you well. Is there any way you can write your question in the chat and I'll read it because I can't hear you.
Desiree, I loved what you said about Rosenkavalier.
Thank you. It's nice to see you.
It sets me up for the debate.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I mean, I think that program notes for a piece that is clearly like Don Quixote can be useful. But I think it's also really amazing. And if you listen to the four last songs, just listen and see if you can feel what's going on. So the song that I played at the beginning is called Morgen, and it's a love song, and it's about the sun will shine and the sun will unite us and we will go forward together forever. And I think it is one of the most beautiful songs ever, and I think you hear that that's what it says. So,
hey, would you tell us a little bit about when the conductor asked you guys to sing or to talk? I think that's fantastic. Tell us a little more about that, please.
So, I mean, maybe this is a nod to a bygone time in orchestra playing because there are times when the orchestra does sing along in the pit, and maybe we're not supposed to. Like, there is a stage band in Traviata where the trombone has a really slidey passage, and we all go, like that. So when Kleiber did this, we came in and there were notes on our stand, and it said, at this point, please say this. And he actually also had us whistle when Baron Ochs come in, and you might be able to hear it. So it's in Act 2. I think it's after the presentation of the Rose, and it's very dum bum 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 bum, and then you hear da 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 da, and you hear, and then Baron Ochs comes in, and I think this might be a Viennese tradition. I can't think of any other operas though. When we are asked to sing, because there are certainly times when we sing along and we shouldn't. So.
No, but it feels like true vaudeville. It feels like something that is everybody's involved, whether it be the audience, whether it be the pit, whether it be the chorus, and so much of today is so formal. To see that is such a welcome departure.
Yes, yes, and it's well, I think. Well, I mean, we'll see what happens to the world later because we may all loosen up a little bit, but there is a well, there is a if I look, I started in the orchestra in 1987 when most of my colleagues were men, and a lot of them came on the job having had something to drink, and so they were a little bit loose in the tongue, like the things they said and the things that happened. And I think now that there's you can't be jocular with your colleagues for fear of and I think there's a fine line because I think it's absolutely right that there were things said to me when I was early in the orchestra that were wrong, and they were wrong because the guy was drunk. But the orchestra is like a team, And I think this idea of us doing things that are maybe a little wrong, but doing them together is nice.
So Desiree, can you hear me? All right. So my question for you is, since Strauss, when you started out the presentation, you were talking about how Strauss was sort of a throwback to that time period and that he didn't really evolve compositionally with all the other composers. Was there any notes about how the other composers felt about him and how he was not changing, but yet still obviously successful?
That's interesting. I didn't come across anything. He was really revered. I mean, if you haven't listened to Salome or Electra, you should listen to them. And actually, Frau ohne Schatten is also um, incredibly dissonant and modern work. It's not like Rosenkavalier, where it's diatonic and it's chromatic, but it's um, and I think in his positions, he from his colleagues and the people in the theater who were trying to put on, make a season full of things, he got some blowback, and I think he was disrespected by younger composers. But I didn't read anywhere. I don't get the idea that he was disrespected by other composers of equal stature. But I mean, if you just think about it, Rosenkavalier is written in 1911, and The Rite of Spring is written in 1912. I mean, they are worlds apart. And the thing is that, because I think about this personally, because I think I'm born in the 1960s and he's born in the 1860s. So my time span is also going to, straddle these two centuries in not insignificant ways. It's not like my grandparents who were born in the 1890s who really were not 19th century. I don't know, Willem. I'll look it up. Thank you. Louise is saying she has a preference for having program notes, which she sometimes saves for after the concerts. I like this, even though I don't think people should feel constrained by those ideas. But I do have a comment question about this production. The cast is fabulous, but I hated the visuals, the sets, etc., especially Act 3. The Marschallin would never have set foot in a bordello, neither would Funninal have allowed his daughter to set foot in there. How can these interpretations by a director be justified? And what did you think of this production? So we're playing very hard in Act 3, and I didn't actually see all of it. We stood up and watched a little bit. If you look online, Robert Carson says that he was trying to really make the contrast between the old and the new, the old world, the old because of Strauss, the old world that Strauss had come from, and the old world which was the 19th century sensibility, which was in 1910-11 about to change. It was the end of Vienna, as it was the end of Austria. It was right before the First World War. And so he was trying to make this contrast in a progressive way. The first act is very conservative, and the second act becomes a little more crass because the Baron is really pretty vulgar with Sophie. And then the last act is really in your face, that the old guard is gone. And as at the end of the opera, when the Marschallin leaves with Herr Funninal, he says, I guess it's, for the young people, and she just says, yeah, that's like how the end goes.
To the 1982 production,
Yeah.
which starred Kiri Te Kanawa, I was asking Desiree about the contrast in the design. That was 5 years before you started playing with them, but
I did play that production.
Pictures,
I played that production, and that production was really set in the 18th century. It was very beautiful. It was very, and the bed scene was very graphic. Yes.
Would you do us all a favor?
Yes.
Would you keep on talking for about the next 2 hours so none of us have to watch the debate?
No.
I mean, you'd be doing a public service.
No, we're gonna stop now so that I can have some dinner, and maybe after the debate is over, listen to some beautiful Strauss music. Thank you all for coming. And please send me emails, send me any suggestions, anything that that you think. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Days.
Bye.
Everybody.
Let's wish us all luck.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye.